here this afternoon with Professor Mark Winston, who's here in the School of Information and Library Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
Could we begin by you telling us a little bit about the various roles that you play here at UNC?
Sure. I've been a faculty member at UNC for about a year and a half, and I teach in the areas of management, leadership, information policy, and I also conduct research in areas of leadership as well, and information policy. And I do quite a bit of consulting and training nationally, work with organizations on management training, leadership training, diversity training as well.
Great, fantastic. And we're so pleased to have you here. Let's talk a little bit about leadership, and what does that mean? And I understand you're actually working on a book that will be out soon on leadership.
I am, actually. Leadership, a topic of great interest to me, and great interest societally. In fact, there are over 350 definitions of leadership, indicating the fact that there's lots of discussion about the issue of leadership. I tend to focus on leadership broadly defined, meaning influence. And the broad definition of leadership also means that there's the potential for individuals in organizations to lead from levels other than senior management only. So leadership certainly is a broadly defined term. And I've, in my research, studied a number of things related to leadership, including identification of potential leaders in organizations, leadership development, leadership training, leadership education in organizations, evaluation of leadership as well. And the book that I'm working on now actually focuses on the question of preparation for leadership, particularly among young people. Tentative title is actually Opportunity for Leadership, Full and Informed Participation.
Interesting. Nice.
And it looks at the question of preparing people for leadership in organizations, but also societally, and the role of information, particularly access to information, in helping leaders to be successful in organizations. So it draws on research from the business literature and from a number of areas, political, leadership, and so on, looking at the question of access to information as a societal principle and the importance of information for solid decision making, but also full participation in society. And the book actually came about as a result of the 50th anniversary of the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education. And the decision, on the face of it, is about equity, access, fairness, ending discrimination. But the decision actually was more broadly about the question of access to education and ultimately access to full participation in society. And the decision was actually pretty important because it was the first major decision of the modern civil rights era. And it really preceded subsequent legislation and court decisions related to other access to full participation, other aspects of access, including civic engagement, such as the Voting Rights Act, as well as access to housing and other aspects of full participation in society. So the book looks at the basis of education being the battleground, if you will, for looking at the principle of access. And it looks at the nature of the constitutional principles that supported this and the fact that we do know quite a bit about how access to information helps people to be more effective in life and in organizations.
Fascinating. So how does the information sort of fit in? I mean, there's, on the one hand, it's access to the information that is part of what makes one a leader. Is that the way it goes? That the more information you have, or the better you're able to use the information that helps you be a better leader?
Absolutely the latter, yes. And the premise of the book is to really attempt to demystify what is typically the dichotomy associated with access to information, that more access to more information is better, access to less information is worse, but in some cases the less is often identified as advantageous because of some of the information being potentially controversial, potentially harmful, and so on. So often there are efforts to limit access. The book actually looks at the question of the complexity of access to information. The fact that it's not necessarily more information, it's quality information. And analytical skills, decision-making skills, the ability to discern being that much more important. Right. And the book looks at the research by people like Warren Bennis and others who are really management researchers, the question of how leaders are more successful when they have more access to quality information and when they have high-level leadership competencies, including decision-making abilities. And looks at the complexity of decision-making among young people, among people of all ages, as informed by quality information and the nature of how decision-making is enhanced. The book also looks at the issue of the internet and the premise that the access to information technology, the access to more information via the internet, computer exposure, enhances decision-making of young people. And the research that indicates that it is not necessarily a one-to-one correlation, that is, more information, better decision-making. In fact, there's a need for both quality information, the ability to discern, but also quality instruction to prepare young people to make use of that information.
That's really interesting. The point you raised earlier about you don't have to sort of be the senior management to actually assume leadership. Tell me a little bit about that. I mean, I could sort of see how someone with talent might have access to information and have good analytic skills to make use of that information. But I mean, does it work for them in organizations, and what are the factors that might influence whether they actually are able to exercise leadership?
Oh, this is a huge issue in organizations because leadership is often equated with management. So conceptually, the assumption is always that leadership, that is influence on the organization, should only come from those in senior management. And one thing we do know is that those who are in senior management tend to have access to more and different types of information, just based on their place in the hierarchy. Research has shown that. But based upon a broadly defined basis for looking at the question of leadership, we determine that at all levels in organizations, individuals have access to valuable information. Of course, this places the onus on senior management to ensure that those at other levels do in fact have access to more information. But it also means that people who are not in senior management often have unique bits of information, often based on their direct interaction with the customer, the client, the user, for example. So that the ability to influence the direction of the organization based upon that tends to be pretty critical. So the assumption is, can we empower people in this way, prepare them and empower them in this way? And this really requires a particular way of thinking for senior managers as well as others within organizations to really think of themselves as leaders from the time they're hired within organizations. So again, the onus falls on senior management, but it really requires individuals and organizations to think of themselves as leaders as well.
So it sounds like a good leader would actually empower their subordinates to actually be leaders and
absolutely, and would assume that we want this high level of participation by people within organizations. Certainly identifying the fact that there are some decisions which are necessarily the purview of only senior management. But that's actually a relatively small number of decisions, to be frank. Certainly this applies to certain human resource related decisions, for example, and certain sort of decisions for which only certain types of information are available and really are confidential or proprietary types of information. But it really requires a different way of thinking within an organization. But it really, we assume, and certainly the research seems to be suggesting, that the quality of decisions is enhanced, that people at various levels in organizations have the opportunity to exert some leadership. Now, of course, the other piece of this is that it has to happen in an environment in which there's not a punitive type of response if individuals in these early stages of exerting leadership don't do everything that necessarily reflects experience in leadership.
Right. Yeah.
So the ability for senior management to create certain environment is pretty important. Yes. It also places the onus on us in higher education, in particularly, and I guess to a certain extent in K through 12 education, to help graduates, future graduates, students, to think of themselves as potential leaders. This is an issue because, particularly in most academic programs, most aspects of professional education, we don't offer leadership coursework as a part of our curriculum. We do tend to say in our mission statements, vision statements, that part of our goal is preparing people to take on leadership roles in the chosen profession across professional education. However, our curricula does not always reflect this emphasis. And if there is no such course, and while we have courses in other areas, for example, we tend to be indicating, at least there appears to be a manifestation of some other things as priorities, as opposed to leadership.
So the leadership isn't sort of just handled in the management course, I take it.
We would within the 3-credit semester-long management course, we certainly would love to make leadership a key priority. However, within a management course, we cover everything from human resource management to planning to evaluation. So many things that leadership is one of many, many, many other topics. So it does create an issue for us. Yes. So no, it's not covered nearly as much as it should be. So we certainly support expanded education and leadership.
Is it your view that people can begin to incorporate leadership principles, ideas in all of the courses, regardless of the content?
I certainly think so. Certainly based on the premise that access to information, quality information, enhances one's ability to lead, would suggest that the course content in any area in a professional field certainly would allow a person to be a more effective leader. So absolutely. I also think the general idea of articulating a tone that indicates that leadership is possible, that we're preparing graduates for leadership roles, is certainly something that should be indicated across the curriculum. Again, another good example of where it's indicated within our mission statement, our statement of purpose, and it certainly should be reflected throughout the curriculum. Again, every course makes perfect sense, I think. Yes. It doesn't happen often enough. About approximately 10% of the programs in our discipline, for example, offer leadership as a course. So it's a relatively small percentage within our profession. And that's not unusual for professional education. So more is needed, yes.
You've mentioned the quality of the information several times. How do we go about assessing the quality or having our students make judgments about quality of information resources?
Absolutely. This is a huge issue because ultimately two things probably need to happen. One is designing systems that allow students to conduct research that allows them access to information of quality. The other is the development of skills. That is analytical, critical thinking skills, so that discernment is a part of what students are able to do. Now again, and this is certainly something that can be evident across the academic curriculum. It's something that employers have said for many years as being a real issue in terms of graduates, not limited to any particular profession. The need for this level is real. So there's no question that the curriculum should support this, preparing students, and certainly with regard to the technology, making the technology more and better able to do this. But certainly because it is individuals who are using the technology, necessarily a need for preparing individuals to do this. So to be able to determine both the applicability of the information, that is information they're locating, how useful is it, looking at the nature of the sources of the information, and certainly you as interviewer are much closer to that particular area of research than I, but certainly there's necessarily the need to both look at the quality of the systems, and certainly systems, we would also say, for example, a person being able to look at a report published by a reputable scientific agency, society, for example, as opposed to something that is of less, well-defined origins. Yes, so source of information being important, but also the ability of the individual to analyze, also critically important. Yes. And we see examples. Certainly the book, one of the things the book focuses on are examples of how more information, not necessarily quality information, complicates the decision-making process. In other words, increasing the amount of information available does not necessarily lead to enhanced decision-making. This is true in the professional context, but also in the personal, sort of social context. I can mention one example of that, if you like. With the increased focus on, one of the major issues that I discuss in the book is decision-making associated with the death penalty. And one of the things the book looks at is not only individual decision-making, but decision-making in the aggregate. Public opinion polling, for example, which tends to be a really good gauge of sort of how more information affects decision-making, for example. With the death penalty, for example, the research has indicated a number of things about the death penalty, including the fact that in recent years there's more information available about death penalty cases. And this really sort of runs the gamut from the increased information available about DNA, forensics evidence, for example, both from the popular media, news media, and to a certain extent from the research as well. And the fact that this type of information tends to complicate the decision-making process. There's a phenomenon known among legal scholars as the CSI effect, based upon the television program CSI, and the sense among people who are not a part of the legal community that there's a potential over-reliance on DNA forensics evidence in cases, typically because of the desire for people to, as jurors, for example, to make the right decision, to make an accurate, correct decision. The challenge here is that there's also a conflicting sort of human desire to see justice done. So in some cases, the desire to see justice done may override the focus on what the DNA forensics evidence tends to tell us, for example. So there's a competing issue. In other words, the increasing amount of information about DNA forensics evidence begins to demystify the process, because it's not only that this evidence is used more, but we have examples of faulty collection of this data, for example, and we also have issues of the data being used to clear individuals of crimes. So certainly examples of individuals sort of being pulled in multiple directions. And the research also shows Thurgood Marshall, Supreme Court Justice prior to that, practicing attorney, developed what were known as the Marshall hypotheses about a death penalty capital cases, for example. And one of those hypotheses was that more information tended to cause the average person to be more likely to oppose the death penalty. So more information caused people to oppose the death penalty. As an hypothesis, that was borne out in the research at that time and in subsequent years. And certainly this makes perfect sense. More information would obviously cause people to think more. In recent years, the increased amount of information tends to have related to things like examples of wrongful convictions and examples of racial disparities in sentencing and an application of the death penalty, both which have been shown, both types of data have been shown to enhance individuals' sense that the death penalty is problematic. So opposition to the death penalty being enhanced by this new information. But the reality is people tend to be overwhelmed because there's more information available. I mentioned just briefly the popular media, but the popular media has also given us much more information about both the legal system but also the death penalty. Both in recent movies, for example, on this particular topic, Dead Men Walking, The Green Mile. Certainly historically, the sort of major film was probably In Cold Blood as well. Also television programs of this type, reality programs of this type. So just an increased amount of information. An increased amount of information about the process of executions, for example. So in other words, the process has changed with more and potentially complicating information. So certainly as an example that's not necessarily professional specific, but which means that there is more information that could potentially complicate the decision-making process.
That's really fascinating. It's interesting to think about how the quality trade-offs take place. I as an old schooler, I suppose, I've heard about leaders having gut feelings, but it sounds like what you're arguing is that it's really not just gut feelings. That it's probably experience of selecting and analyzing information over periods of time that give us those kinds of insights that allow us to make good decisions.
I think that's true, and that's probably for two reasons. One is that the research about decision making indicates that gut feelings can be misleading because of the extent to which gut feelings can be influenced by emotion, which is necessarily problematic, and certainly when the stakes are high in a range of types of personal and professional decisions that we really don't have the option, unfortunately, of faltering. So certainly the issue of emotion is certainly at issue with regard to the nature of gut feelings. The other issue with regard to gut feelings, you and I have talked about Malcolm Gladwell's book. One of Malcolm Gladwell's books we've discussed, Tipping Point. But in his book, Blink, he talks about the issue of gut feelings and how people make decisions. And one of the things he says is that for people who are experienced in their discipline, in their profession, their gut feelings are not really gut feelings. They're so informed by their knowledge that what may appear to be a quick gut reaction to something is actually a very quick systematic process that's fully informed. So gut feelings, if they are in fact informed, decisions that are really based on experience, knowledge, and so on, can be effective. The challenge with management and leadership is that gut decisions can be influenced by a number of things. Human resource management is an example. Often there is so much emotion involved in some of these decisions, hiring, firing, disciplinary actions, for example. Also the research associated with things like potential discrimination and the individuals with whom we feel most comfortable being people with whom we have the most in common, suggesting certainly that biases can influence the decision-making process. So gut feelings, a complicated area. Yes.
Absolutely. Well, this is really fascinating. I'll look forward to reading the full manuscript in the coming weeks. I want to go back to a really nice phrase that you used when you introduced the Brown versus the Board of Education sort of motivation here. Equity, fairness, and access were three of the terms that you used. And I think those are really powerful terms. Can you say a little bit more about that with respect to what we as information professionals can do to promote these values?
I can certainly try to do that. I think one of the things that's interesting about the basis for education as the place in which this first major case took place is that the framers of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence and so on viewed education as, if you will, the great equalizer. And part of their realization, which was quite interesting, was the fact that they saw that the only appropriate retribution after slavery was education. The only attempt to provide some sort of remedy for, at that point, 250 years or so of slavery was, in fact, education. So the fact that education was used as this, as the opportunity for the first major case that preceded the other cases was based on the idea that education prepares people for full participation in society, increases the level of opportunity, increases the ability to fully participate in terms of civic engagement, professionally, and so on. Really to be an informed participant. And the nature of the idea was being able to make use of more information, better information, to really to be a contributing part of an informed citizenry. certainly in our field. Certainly our field, the professional values that support every profession. In our field, those professional values are termed information ethics. Access to information is one of those components. Intellectual freedom, valuing intellectual property, privacy and confidentiality. Again, a number of these components of information ethics. Certainly in our field, we influence a lot of the information policy in this country, for example. And certainly in our field, the idea that ensuring access is a necessary component of preparing people in society to be informed participants, informed citizens, being pretty key. We do this certainly through libraries. We also do this through technology, through our potential to impact private sector organizations that do a number of things, including providing computer exposure within schools, for example. And certainly educationally, one of the roles that we have within this profession is preparing practitioners in this particular discipline to value the idea of equity of access. And this particular case was controversial, as you might imagine, but certainly one of the issues associated with the case was that education would provide the opportunity, personal opportunity, but also the opportunity to be informed participants. The basis for the Republic, as it was defined in those founding documents, was an informed citizenry. So our entire profession is based upon the idea, whether we look at the nature of the access, what sort of venue we're using, what sort of technology, what sort of organizations support that, libraries and others. Certainly, this is our profession is based upon the idea that this is necessary.
Wow, that's fantastic. That's quite powerful statement. There are other things that you'd like to discuss, share with us, either about this particular book or other things that are on your plate nowadays?
Well, let's see. I could certainly talk about the nature of how our field touches other fields, and really how there's so many issues that really are relevant to the nature of what we do. Often when I meet people either elsewhere within the university or outside of higher education, for example, and they find out in which areas I teach, that is management, leadership, and so on, there's often a little bit of surprise that such courses are offered in an information and library science curriculum. So certainly I begin by describing that all of the information professionals certainly will be managing organizations, libraries, corporate IT operations, a range of types of organizations, but also an understanding of information and management prepares people for a range of types of roles. So what we do really touches on a lot of things. Certainly a significant part of my work looks at the question of leadership and diversity as well. One of the things we know about diversity as an issue is that often the discussions of diversity societally are not informed discussions, not informed by information, for example. So again, attempts to address that tend to be pretty critical. One of the things that I address in the book is that many attempts to limit access to information have related to publications or websites or controversial statements related to issues that are racial in nature, for example. Obviously, the most recent example was Don Imus's comments. There's very, very prominent example. But there are a range of examples, certainly dating back to things like books that are always on the banned books list, like Huckleberry Finn, because it uses the N-word, for example, and examples of attempting to limit statements by individuals, such as Bill Bennett, who's made racially charged statements, for example, and a range of others. But the fact that these discussions are related to the issue of access to information. So certainly I think it's important for me to say that I think that our profession intersects so many other aspects of what happens societally, professionally, and in a range of sectors, higher education, public and private sectors as well. So happy to talk about how much we're connected to so many other aspects of life and work.
Well, this is just fascinating and quite informative, and we thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure to talk with you.